My name is Addison Rose Whitmore, and I am 19 years old. The year is 1928, and I live in the town of Silver Pine, nestled deep in the blue-tinged hills of Vermont. It is a place where the winters fall quiet, the maple trees bleed red in October, and the women, well, we were expected to be quiet too. I wasn't born with silver spoons in my mouth. My father, Walter Whitmore, ran a small wood mill that he inherited from his father. My mother, Grace, was the kind of woman who never left the kitchen without flour on her cheeks or hymns on her lips. We didn't have much, but I had books, old, creased, hand-me-down books that smelled like cedar and spoke to me louder than any person ever did. From the time I could read, I knew I wanted to study at St. James University, the most prestigious college within 100 miles, known for its stone towers and whispering halls. It was where the brightest minds in the Northeast gathered. It was also where James Carleton, the son of the university's founder and heir to the Carleton fortune, studied law and played piano like the devil played Temptation. I met him when I was just 16. It was at the local harvest fair. I was reading a weathered copy of The Count of Monte Cristo on a hay bale when he walked by, crisp white shirt rolled at the sleeves, and eyes the color of stormy lakes. He called me Book Girl. I remember it. I remember how I hated that nickname and how I secretly wanted him to say it again. By 17, we were writing each other letters. By 18, he had kissed me under the chestnut tree behind the old library, and by 19, I had saved up every penny from tutoring, sewing, and helping at the mill to apply for the one thing I had dreamed of since I was a little girl, the St. James Women's Academic Scholarship for Excellence in Literature. I remember the morning the letter arrived. It was sealed with the Carleton crest. Addison Rose Whitmore, it read. After consideration by the Board of Scholars, we regret to inform you. I read it again, and again, the words twisted like barbed wire in my chest. You are not selected due to your limited qualifications and gender suitability for such academic investment. They said it plain as thunder. I wasn't worth the scholarship. Not because I lacked the grades. I was the top scorer in all of Rutland County. Not because I lacked passion. My essays had been praised even by a professor from the university itself. But because I was just a girl. Just a girl. James tried to soften the blow. My father can get you in some other way, he said. You know how things are. Let's not make a scene. He kissed my cheek, told me he loved me, and promised he'd come back after summer. I waited, but letters stopped coming, and one cold morning, I found out why from a page of the Town Gazette. Engagement announced, James Carleton and Margaret Fairchild to wed in autumn. Margaret, of course, rich, beautiful, educated in France. The perfect face for the Carleton family legacy. I stared at the photo, his hand on her waist, his smile for the camera, her wearing the same brooch he once gave me. It wasn't just the scholarship I had lost. I had been dismissed, deemed unworthy, forgotten. I sat by the fireplace that night, the letter in one hand and a bottle of my father's old whiskey in the other, and I made myself a promise, burned it deep into my ribs. They will remember me, and I'll make sure they never forget what it cost to call me just a girl. The days after I saw that engagement announcement were bitter and slow. Autumn crept into Silver Pine, the wind colder, the trees bare. Every passing carriage seemed louder. Every smiling couple at the town square felt like an insult. And every time someone said, "You'll find someone else, Addison," I bit my tongue so hard I thought I'd swallow blood. What they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that James and I had made plans. He had told me he loved me the way a man tells a woman when he wants to own her. With poetry, with warmth, with kisses stolen beneath moonlight. We spoke of our future like it was already sewn into the stars. I had written entire essays for him, papers he later submitted as his own. He once told me I was the secret behind his brilliance. That was the only truth he ever told. But when the time came to choose, he chose her. Not the girl who knew the smell of his old books and the tune of his mother's favorite lullaby. He chose the one with lace gloves and pedigree. I'd see them sometimes in town, riding together in his family's black carriage. Margaret with her neck wrapped in velvet and her words dipped in sugar. He looked different now, stiffer, quieter, as though he'd already given up being James and was now just another Carleton. I began to feel like a ghost in my own story. I stopped visiting the market, stopped tutoring, stopped writing. What was the point? I remember the night I burned his letters. There were over 40 of them, tied with a red ribbon, kept in the drawer of my writing desk. Each one started the same way. Dearest Addison, Each one ended with a promise he never meant to keep. I lit them one by one, feeding them to the iron stove like sacrifices. The room smelled like scorched paper and old lies. I told myself that would be the end of it, but ghosts don't leave when you burn the evidence. They linger. Then one afternoon, a letter came that wasn't from James. It was addressed in elegant, unfamiliar handwriting. Miss Addison Rose Whitmore of Silverpine. The seal was embossed with the insignia of Steedy, James University. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a single note from Professor Elliot Maynard, the chair of the university's literature department. I had met him once at a county reading event. He had praised my essay on Hawthorne and said, "A mind like yours should echo in halls of granite and ink," he wrote. "Though the scholarship board rejected your application, I have since read your essays. I must say, Miss Whitmore, I believe history will regret overlooking you. If you should ever seek opportunity beyond what small men have allowed you, know that some doors remain open though often hidden from view. No offer, no scholarship, just sympathy dressed in wisdom." Still, it was the first light I'd seen in weeks. I pinned that letter on my wall like a prayer, and I started writing again. Not just poems or essays this time. I wrote everything. About James, about Margaret, about St. James University and the men who sat in velvet-lined offices making decisions. About women like me. I wrote about injustice, about power, about the sharp edge of silence. Each page felt like digging a grave and building a ladder. But life wasn't just ink and fury. My father's mill had a rough winter. Orders slowed. One of our saws broke, and we didn't have the money to fix it. I took up work at Miss Beatrice's bookshop, a tiny store near the edge of town. Dusty shelves, old armchairs, and the smell of leather-bound hope. That's where I first heard about the Carleton Family Donation Gala. It was to be held in December. A grand event to celebrate the Carleton family's donation of $10 million toward the expansion of the university's library. $10 million, enough to buy books for every child in Vermont. Enough to feed every family in Silverpine through the winter. And yet, it was going to be used to name a building after the same people who said girls like me weren't worth a scholarship. That's when it started. A thought, a whisper. Not revenge exactly, at least not yet. Just a seed. A flame that flickered quietly in my chest. I began to ask questions. I learned that James's father, Charles Carleton, was about to retire from the university's board. That he was selling off properties. That he had debts no one was supposed to know about. Miss Beatrice, who'd lived in Silverpine longer than the Rhodes had, once said, "In this world, girl, knowledge is better than gold. But if you get both, that's power." So I kept writing, kept listening, kept saving. I had no plan yet, just fire in my heart, and a secret promise that I repeated every night before bed. They may have denied me a place in their halls, but one day, they'll walk through doors that bear my name. I learned, in time, that the first stage of betrayal isn't heartbreak, it's shame, not because of what they did to you, but because of what you let yourself believe. I had believed James would stand beside me when the world shut its doors. I had believed a scholarship was earned through merit, not inherited through name, and worst of all, I had believed that being a girl in Silverpine was a curse, instead of a challenge. It was during the long, wind-bitten nights working at Miss Beatrice's bookshop that I began to rebuild myself in secret. I didn't speak much to the customers. I wore my hair pinned back, kept my chin tucked low. I learned how to be invisible, because invisible girls hear everything. I overheard scholars whispering about board meetings. I heard Margaret Fairchild's cousin complaining that James seemed less lively now, less himself. I listened to merchants talk about the Carleton family's shaky investments and real estate speculation in upstate New York, and one night, just as the first snow of December coated the lantern-lit streets of Silverpine, a professor from St. James came into the shop. Professor Arthur Bellamy, rotund, pompous, smelling of ink and brandy. He didn't recognize me. Why would he? I was just the girl from the county they had cast aside. He bought a rare edition of Milton, and as he counted his coins, he muttered to Miss Beatrice, "The Carleton Library better be built on time, or the trustees will have Charles's head." $10 million is no small donation, and the Fairchilds are watching every brick. Beatrice raised an eyebrow. "I heard the money hasn't arrived yet." Professor Bellamy chuckled. "Oh, it's all a bluff. The old man's selling off his assets just to make the down payment. He wants his family name carved into the stones before the winter ends. Legacy and all that nonsense." I tucked that information into my mind like a blade into a boot. A bluff, they said. A legacy, they said. Funny how men scramble to be remembered when they've spent their lives trying to forget the damage they caused. 2 days later, I saw James. For the first time in months, he was standing outside Whitmore's bakery, just across from my father's mill, holding a small parcel and shielding his fiancée from the snow. Margaret looked as perfect as ever, fur trim at her sleeves, her golden hair coiled like pastry. James caught my eye. For a moment, we both froze. I waited for him to nod, to speak, to acknowledge the girl he once held like a secret to precious, to share. But he looked away. As if I were no more than a passing shadow. I didn't cry, not anymore. By then, the Addison who cried over boys and scholarships was already fading. In her place was someone else, someone sharper, someone waiting. A week before Christmas, something strange happened. A man arrived in Silverpine. Tall, thin, with a narrow smile and a coat stitched from another world. Mr. Franklin Hargrove. He asked Beatrice for directions to the estate sales. He was, as he explained, in the business of acquiring forgotten properties and abandoned opportunities. I don't know what possessed me, but I followed him outside the shop that day. Are you buying land? I asked boldly. He looked me over with mild interest. I acquire real estate occasionally on behalf of clients. Why do you ask? There's a man named Charles Carlton. I hear he's offloading properties. You may want to speak to him. He raised a brow. And you are? I hesitated, then said plainly, someone who knows what it's like to be underestimated. He chuckled. Ah, a dangerous sort. We spoke for a few minutes. I learned he worked out of Boston, had dealings across New England, and specialized in high pressure acquisitions, buying low from desperate men who thought they were still kings. We exchanged names. Just that, nothing more. But the next morning, I found a note tucked into the door of the bookshop. Miss Whitmore, you have a sharp eye. I looked into Mr. Carlton. His holdings are indeed unstable. One in particular may interest you. Parcel 112. The land earmarked for the university's new library. Shall we make a deal? F.H. My breath caught. The land for the new library. Up for sale. Unsecured. Vulnerable. The Carlton family had boasted of a donation that didn't yet exist. They had denied me a scholarship worth $200. But now, a $10 million dream was standing on trembling ground. And I had just found the crack. I stared at that note from Mr. Franklin Hargrove until the ink might as well have burned itself into my skin. Parcel 112, the land meant for the new Carlton Library, the same library that was announced with speeches, headlines, and applause before the funds had ever been secured. Before Charles Carlton had even paid for the dirt it was supposed to be built on. It was all a stage play, and I had found the rip in the curtain. That night, I visited my father's mill office after hours, when everyone had gone home and the snow had turned Silverpine's roads to powder. I lit a lamp and opened the safe where he kept old deeds, documents, and maps. Among them, I found what I was looking for: land records from Stede, James County. There it was, parcel 112, on the southern edge of the university campus. A 3-acre plot bordering the original stone library, filed under Carlton Holdings Ltd., but tagged for transitional reassignment, meaning it wasn't owned yet. It was in limbo, and in limbo, anything is possible. The next morning, I traveled to Rutland, the county seat, using the last of the money I had saved from tutoring. I visited the Registrar of Land Affairs, a building with dusty halls and bored clerks. I posed as an assistant to Mr. Hargrove. It wasn't a complete lie. We were, in some strange, quiet way, aligned now, with the right smile, a borrowed coat that made me look older, and enough confidence to bluff. I got what I came for: a list of the Carlton family's current holdings, a note confirming their pending transaction on parcel 112, and buried among the legal filings, a copy of an emergency asset relief authorization, the kind men sign when they are bleeding money but don't want to look like they're dying. Charles Carlton was desperate, selling property to cover public promises, just like Franklin Hargrove said. When I returned to Silverpine that evening, a black carriage was waiting outside the bookshop. Mr. Hargrove stepped out, tipping his hat. Walk with me, Miss Whitmore? He asked. We strolled past the frozen fountains and empty cafes, down to the edge of town. You were right about Carlton, he said. The man's unraveling faster than a hem with no thread. The parcel can be purchased by weeks and quietly. but it will take capital, which I assume you don't have. I didn't flinch. I have something better. He laughed. Do you now? I have motive. I have information. And I have the name that nobody expects to see carved in marble. He studied me for a long time. You want to own it. I want to buy it. With what? With everything I've got. I told him what I had: my modest savings, a portion of the land my grandfather once owned, and a long-forgotten deed to an old orchard just outside of Silverpine. It wasn't much, but it was real. I can't give you the whole amount, he said finally, but I can front the rest under one condition. What's that? You don't just buy the land. You name the library. I blinked. Why? Because men like Carlton build monuments to themselves to cover the cracks in their legacy. But when someone like you, someone they dismissed, puts her name on their dream, it ruins them in ways money never could. I didn't sleep that night. I walked the creaky floorboards of my room, thinking of every moment that brought me here. James's silence, the board's rejection, Margaret's smug smile, the way they had all moved on as if I were nothing but a phase. A story barely worth telling, and now I had a chance to rewrite the ending. The next day, I sold the orchard. Miss Beatrice helped me notarize it. My father, bless his tired eyes, didn't ask questions when I told him I needed access to the family ledger. He only said, "You're your mother's daughter." When she got quiet, I knew something was about to change. 3 days later, the transaction went through. Parcel 112 was no longer Carlton S.it belonged to a quiet girl from Silverpine.it. Belonged to me, legally, fully, and with a binding clause that required any future library construction on it to bear the name of the registered buyer, which meant the Addison R. Whitmore Library. I kept the news to myself. There was no reason to rush. No need for declarations. Let them plan their celebration. Let them print programs and give speeches. Let Margaret wear her lace gloves and James button his collar. They had no idea the floor beneath their legacy had shifted, and it was only a matter of time before it cracked. The town of Silverpine hadn't seen so much glitter since the railroad first came through in '03. The streets were swept. Lanterns hung from every post. Gold-edged invitations were delivered by hand. Word had spread fast. The Carlton family was hosting the St. James University Winter Gala, the most prestigious event in the state. The press from Boston and Concord would be there, along with scholars, governors, and donors dressed in velvet and pride. They were going to unveil the first look at the university's new Carlton Memorial Library, a $10 million donation to preserve the future of American scholarship. I smiled when I read the flyer at the bakery. I knew something they didn't. Let them print the name on pamphlets. Let them rehearse their speeches. The land beneath that library already bore another name, signed in ink and blood, and every sleepless hour I'd spent being forgotten. Addison R. Whitmore. And no matter what they built or how high they reached, they would have to bow to that name. But I wasn't done yet. Revenge, if done right, isn't loud, it's elegant, poised, lethal only when it's already too late to run. I spent the week before the gala preparing. I had a dress tailored by hand at Mrs. Henley's, a green silk gown that reminded me of the forest just beyond Silverpine. Something strong, something alive. I wore my mother's brooch, an old thing made of jet and brass, tucked at the collar. Beatrice insisted on doing my hair herself. She brushed it back, twisted it into a soft wave, and said, "They won't know who you are." "They don't need to," I said. "Not yet." The night of the gala, snow floated in the air like whispers. Carriages lined up outside Carlton Hall, the estate mansion where the event was being hosted. A string quartet played near the entrance. Wine was served before coats were even removed. Inside it was marble floors and chandeliers, champagne glasses, and forced laughter. James stood near the center of the room, dressed in deep navy and polished shoes. Margaret Fairchild was on his arm, glowing like royalty. They both looked older, stiffer, like they'd been forced to grow up too quickly under the pressure of legacy. I walked past them without a word. He didn't notice me, not at first, but Margaret did. Her eyes landed on me with curiosity, then confusion, then just for a flicker worry. I was no longer the girl they had discarded in a letter. I was a storm in heels, a quiet guest in their house, holding their future between gloved fingers. A man tapped his glass at the front of the hall. It was Charles Carlton, gray at the temples, thin in the face, "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "tonight is not merely a celebration of the Carlton family's legacy. It is a celebration of knowledge, of progress, and of the next chapter. At St. James University." Applause. Flashbulbs. "We are proud to unveil the plans for the Carlton Memorial Library, built on land now secured for academic expansion. Construction begins in the new year. May the Carlton name forever be associated with the pursuit of wisdom." The room clapped. I didn't. Instead, I stepped outside onto the marble balcony, cold air washing over my skin. I reached into my clutch and pulled out the deed, not a copy. The original, signed, stamped, sealed, property of Addison R. Whitmore, and in my other hand, a second envelope, which I had sent earlier that afternoon by courier. To the St. James University Board of Trustees, marked urgent. Inside, a full record of the purchase, including documentation that the land they had planned to build on no longer belonged to the Carlton family and that they had no legal right to use it without my approval. I didn't demand money. I demanded one thing, a name change. The Carlton Memorial Library would be built, yes, but not with their name carved into stone. It would be called the Whitmore Library for Independent Scholarship, in honor of students previously denied opportunity due to gender, origin, or economic class. If the board refused, I would take the matter to the press, to the public, to every school and academic council in New England, and if the Carltons wished to continue construction, they would have to lease the land from me annually at a cost they could never afford without scandal. My terms were clear and legally unbreakable. Behind me, the crowd continued to toast, clink, and cheer. They were celebrating a victory that had already been undone. By a girl they once called unfit, unworthy, just a girl. I walked back into the ballroom just in time to see James finally notice me. His face paled. He took a step forward, then stopped, as if realizing how far I'd gone. Margaret whispered something in his ear. Her eyes were sharp now. I met her gaze. I didn't smile. I nodded. It was done. Let them toast. Let them think they'd won. By morning, their empire would belong to a girl in green silk and quiet vengeance. When I woke the next morning, the frost on the windows hadn't melted, but the world had already begun to burn. I didn't need to leave my home to hear the whisper of it. It started in the chiming of the shop bells across town, in the hurried clicks of heels on cobblestone, in the silences between words at the post office. Something had changed. By the time I stepped into Miss Beatrice's bookshop, the news had reached even the dustiest corners. She looked up from her ledger with a smirk. "Addison Whitmore, you wicked thing." She handed me a newspaper from the Rutland Register. The ink was still smudged from the press. The headline read, "Ownership Scandal Delays Carlton Library Property Acquired by Local Woman Weeks Ago." And just beneath it, St. James Board reviewing new naming proposal from Addison R. Whitmore. It had happened faster than I expected. By some miracle, or perhaps the simple fact that truth speaks louder than legacy, the university board hadn't waited long. The moment they received my deed, they'd called an emergency session. When they realized the land had never officially transferred into Carlton hands, they had no legal ground to stand on. Not even James could charm them past a contract. The article even quoted Professor Eliot Maynard, the same man who once wrote me a letter of sympathy. "Miss Whitmore has reminded us that scholarship is not about inheritance or bloodlines, but merit and persistence." Her initiative and clarity are, frankly, an embarrassment to those of us who once sat in judgment. I nearly dropped the paper. Miss Beatrice poured me tea. "They don't know what to do with you now," she said. "Good," I whispered. Later that afternoon, I took a walk past the university gates. The same iron bars I once pressed my hands against as a little girl, dreaming of what lay beyond them. Now I walked by slowly, chin high, like I had always belonged. Students gathered in clusters, reading newspapers, whispering. I saw James. He was alone, standing near the main statue of his grandfather, staring blankly at the article in his hand. For a moment, our eyes met. He looked like a man who had watched his house fall stone by stone. He walked toward me. I didn't move. "Addison," he began. I raised a hand. "Don't." He stopped. There was a flicker of the boy I once loved in his face, just enough to make my chest twist, but it passed quickly. He was no longer mine to mourn. He had chosen comfort over truth, silk over fire. I didn't know what my father was doing, he said quietly. "No," I replied, "you just didn't care until it cost you something." He looked away. Why? He asked finally. I tilted my head. Because someone needed to remind all of you that what you throw away can learn to grow teeth. He didn't follow me when I walked away. The university's board released a formal statement 3 days later. They acknowledged the unexpected but valid transfer of property ownership. They praised Miss Whitmore's commitment to academic equity, and they announced that the future university library would now bear the name, the Whitmore Library for Independent Scholarship. They tried to save face, pretended it was a partnership, that the name was a mutual decision, but everyone in town knew the truth. The Carlton family hadn't donated the land. They'd been outmaneuvered. By the girl they said wasn't worth a scholarship. Suddenly, doors began to open. I received invitations from newspapers, schools, professors wanting to read my work. The same people who once ignored me now asked for interviews. One magazine even called me the quiet fire of Silverpine, and yet, I didn't accept most of it. I wasn't doing this for fame. This wasn't about being adored. It was about reclaiming the space I was denied, about building something stronger than love or approval, about planting a flag in a place they swore I'd never reach, and maybe, somewhere deeper, it was about that 16-year-old girl who sat reading The Count of Monte Cristo on a hay bale, never knowing the power she'd one day hold. The best part, I wasn't done, not yet, because while the world watched the Carlton name sink beneath the snow, I had already started work on something else. In a letter to Professor Maynard, I proposed that the Whitmore Library not just be a building but a program, a fully funded literary grant for underprivileged girls from rural towns like mine. Girls who were told they'd never make it. Girls who were told they were just a girl. The board hesitated, then they agreed, because now they feared me more than they pitied me. The girl they rejected had become a patron, a landowner, a symbol, and the whispers began to turn into something else: respect. The Whitmore Library wasn't even built yet, and already it had become more than stone and timber. It was a story, a symbol, a quiet thunder that shook loose the dust from every closed door in every corridor where decisions were made by men who had never been told no. And I was no longer just the girl who bought the land. I had become the girl who rewrote the ending. But stories, as I've learned, don't rest easily once they're set in motion. Within weeks of the university's announcement, letters began arriving, dozens of them, then hundreds. Not from journalists this time, or donors or society women seeking to praise me, but from girls, young women across New England, some barely 15, some in their early 20s, most of them from towns smaller than Silverpine, with hands calloused from work, voices too timid for salons, and dreams that lived in secret notebooks. They wrote to me about what it meant to see my name. To know someone like them could be heard, could be seen, could own land meant to crush them. Their letters filled a drawer, then a second. By spring, I had an entire cabinet full. Miss Beatrice cried the first time she read one aloud. So did I. It became clear, this couldn't stop with me. The Carlton name had been reduced to scandalous whispers. Rumors leaked that Charles Carlton had stepped down from the university board, that the Fairchild family had quietly pulled financial support, that James had moved to Boston to let the dust settle. Let it settle then. While they sank, I proposed a formal scholarship, the Whitmore Grant for Girls in Literature, to be funded in part by rent the university now paid me annually for library land use. I partnered with Professor Maynard, whose loyalty had proven real, and together we designed the program. We picked 10 girls from across the state in the first year. No applications, no paperwork. We found them the way real talent is always found, in schoolrooms, in libraries, in kitchens where the smell of bread and ink compete for attention. One of them, Clara Dunhill, was 16. Her essay on Jane Eyre was better than any I'd ever written. She worked at her father's stable 6 days a week. Said no one ever asked her what she thought of books before. I sat across from her at our first meeting, and I told her, "You won't have to fight the way I did, but you'll still need to be sharper than those who never had to fight at all." She smiled. "I already am," and in her eyes, I saw a fire that was older than her age. The same one I once carried alone. Now, I wasn't alone, not anymore. The townsfolk of Silverpine, those who once patted my head and said, "Books won't change your life, dear," now greeted me with respect. The same clerk at the registrar who once called me young lady now addressed me as Miss Whitmore and stood when I entered the room. Power shifts slowly, and then, all at once, even my father, a man of few words and slower smiles, had begun calling me Addie again. the way he did when I was a child and still believed the world was fair. But revenge, I learned, doesn't feel like fire forever. At first, it burns. Then it simmers. Then it becomes ash. And out of that ash, if you are brave enough, something else grows, a legacy. Still, some shadows lingered. One afternoon, I received a letter postmarked Boston. The handwriting was familiar, neat, measured. James, I opened it slowly, unsure whether I wanted to see apologies or excuses. Instead, I saw this. Addison, I heard what you've done. All of it. I don't expect forgiveness. I never did. But I want you to know I was wrong. You never needed me to believe in you. But I think I always needed you to believe in me. And now that you don't, I finally see who I am without you. They will write about you for decades. I'll only ever be a footnote. Yours once. He folded the letter and placed it in the drawer. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I felt nothing at all. He was right. He had become a footnote. I, on the other hand, had become the narrator. And the story wasn't done. That spring, the university broke ground on the new library. The dean offered to have me cut the ribbon when it opened. I declined. Let them do the ceremony. Let them polish their plaques. My name was already carved in the contract. And that was enough. The first stones of the Whitmore Library were laid on a rainy Thursday in April. I stood across the street, in my coat and gloves, watching quietly beneath the brim of my hat. I didn't attend the groundbreaking ceremony. I didn't give a speech. I didn't even wave to the crowd gathered under their umbrellas. I just watched. It was enough. The carved limestone blocks were delivered by train. The campus cleared space. Students whispered when they walked past the construction signs, now printed with my name. Every week, new beams rose. New windows were framed. And through it all, I remained mostly silent. Silverpine knew what I'd done. The world outside our little town had started to know too. But I had nothing left to prove. Not to them. Not to James. Not even to myself. That's when the letter from Margaret Fairchild arrived. It came in a thick ivory envelope, monogrammed in gold. No return address, just a crimson wax seal and my name, written in the same loopy cursive I'd seen across the Carlton estate menus and wedding invitations. I opened it slowly. Addison, you don't know me, not really. And I suppose I don't know you either, beyond what James once said, or what the society papers now print. But I know what it's like to be made into a nameplate, a statue, a wife. I know what it's like to be chosen, not because you are best, but because you are proper. James never loved me. He loved you, even when he didn't understand it. And I never hated you, not until you made me see what I could never be. My legacy is stitched into a family I didn't choose. Yours is carved into a world you built yourself. I don't envy you, Addison, but I do envy your freedom. Sincerely, Margaretti stared at the letter long after the words blurred. I didn't know what I felt. Sympathy? No. But I did understand something I hadn't before. Margaret hadn't stolen James. She had accepted the life I refused to settle for. She chose obedience. I chose the storm, and storms don't apologize for the damage they leave behind. That evening, I walked past the university again. The library was halfway built now, its arches taking form, the central dome rising toward the clouds like a promise. A few students stood near the site, talking in low voices. One of them, a girl in a gray shawl, caught my eye. She hurried over. Are you Miss Whitmore? I nodded. She blushed. I'm Eliza Coates. I'm one of this year's grant recipients. I smiled. You're the girl from Barry who wrote about Melville. She lit up. Yes. You actually read it? I read every word. She looked down, nervous. I just wanted to say thank you for giving girls like me a chance. I placed a hand gently on her shoulder. No, thank you for taking it. She hugged me without warning, without asking, and I let her. I thought about how far I'd come from the girl crying by the fire, clutching a rejection letter. How far from the library steps I had once dreamed of climbing. Now, I was building them, but stories, like seasons, don't pass without one last frost. It came 3 days later. I was at the bookshop with Miss Beatrice, helping her organize spring titles when a man entered, coat dripping, hat in hand. James. He looked different now, not older exactly, but quieter, softer around the edges. Addison, he said, voice almost a whisper. Miss Beatrice vanished into the back without a word. I folded the ledger closed. What do you want, James? He stepped closer. I needed to see it. The library. The way they talk about it now. The way they talk about you. and he looked at me like someone studying a constellation. I thought I lost you when I chose Margaret, but the truth is, I never had you. Not really. No, I said. You had the girl who believed in fairy tales. He nodded. And now I write them. He gave a sad smile. They say you bought the land out of spite. I used to believe that. And now? He hesitated. Now I think you bought it because you knew what it would cost to stay small. The room went still. For a moment, the silence between us wasn't bitter, it was clean, cold, like snow that has just fallen, hiding every path behind you. I never said goodbye, he said. You never had to. I replied. He offered his hand, not in romance, in respect. I shook it, and for the first time since the chestnut tree, I forgave him not for what he did, but for who he couldn't be. As he walked out, the wind carried the scent of spring through the open door. Beatrice returned, holding a fresh pot of tea. Well, it's done, I said simply. Not just the building, not just the revenge, the story, my story, and the next chapter. It was mine to write. They opened the doors to the Whitmore Library for Independent Scholarship on the first day of September. The sun rose behind its new stone facade, lighting the stained glass windows like a cathedral, not of faith, but of knowledge. 100 years from now, they would say it looked like it had always been there, like the land had waited for it, like the building had risen not from bricks, but from purpose. The ceremony was public. The newspapers came. So did the professors, trustees, and alumni who once sat in rooms deciding who was worthy. Now, they stood in line just to walk through my library. I arrived quietly, without fanfare, in a dark blue dress with a pearl clasp at my throat. I didn't wear gloves. I wanted to feel the stone, the banisters, the door handles I had paid for. With years of pain, Miss Beatrice walked beside me, straight-backed and teary-eyed. You built a church, she whispered. No, I said. I built a sword. Inside, the ceilings rose like wings. Shelves stretched tall and proud, already lined with volumes, rare books, donated collections, and a new section near the west window titled, Voices Unheard. It would house works by women from towns like Silverpine. Women denied, women forgotten, women remembered. A small plaque at the entrance read, dedicated to the minds they said were too small, too soft, too silent. May they echo forever. There was no mention of the Carlton family. Their name had been scrubbed from every surface. Their scandal, once whispered through campus corridors, had gone quiet, buried beneath the louder truth that now stood 4 stories high. A girl had taken their legacy and rewritten it in her own ink. The students began to arrive by noon. Girls first, dozens of them, wide-eyed and smiling, dressed in worn shoes and carrying notebooks too full for their satchels. I saw Eliza Coates again, leading 2 other girls toward the reading room. They paused when they saw me. Eliza whispered, "She's the one." I offered them a nod, and they nodded back, not out of reverence, but out of recognition. They saw me, not as a legend, not as a ghost, but as proof that it could be done, that they could do it too. Outside, the reporters were gathering around Professor Maynard, who had become something of an unlikely champion for the revolution I'd sparked. He told them, "Miss Whitmore reminds us that rebellion doesn't always look like fire. Sometimes it looks like a library card." I laughed when I heard that. He wasn't wrong. The governor's wife gave a speech I didn't listen to. The board chair fumbled through a paragraph thanking our partner, Miss Addison R. Whitmore, whose vision, and so on. They still didn't understand. I wasn't a partner, I was the architect, and I didn't build the Whitmore Library to be applauded. I built it to be entered, to be used, to be lived in by minds told they weren't big enough to matter. As the crowd began to trickle inside, I slipped out the back door. I had no interest in handshakes or clapping. I didn't need my picture in the paper. Let them marvel at the building. Let them quote me later, when I wasn't there to interrupt with truth. I walked the path that curved down toward the old orchard, what used to be mine, before I sold it, to fund this dream. It was overgrown now, wild and free. Like me, there was a bench near the edge of the hill, where the campus and town met. I sat there and let the wind curl through my hair. Leaves rustled like pages turning in a book I hadn't finished yet. That's when Clara Dunhill found me. She sat beside me quietly, her cheeks pink from running. "I thought you left," she said. "Not yet," I replied. She looked toward the rising library. "It's beautiful. So are the stories waiting to be written inside it." Clara turned to me. "How did you know that this would work? That they'd listen?" I smiled at her. They didn't have to listen, I said. They just had to learn what happens when a girl stops asking for permission. She held out a small notebook worn at the edges. Will you read this? I took it in my hands. Only if you promise to finish it. I will, she said. Because of you. No, I said softly, watching the wind scatter blossoms into the sky. Because of you. They say legacy is something others decide for you. They say it's built by men in boardrooms, signed in ledgers, whispered into family names, and stitched into the collars of old suits. But I learned the truth. Legacy is claimed, and I claimed mine with ink, paper, and silence that cut deeper than any scream. It's strange now to look at the world from the other side of the war. I walk past the stone columns of the Whitmore Library, and I don't feel fire anymore. No bitterness, no ache, just weight. The satisfying weight of something earned, of a future cracked open by the heel of a girl who refused to stay small. The day after the grand opening, I returned to the library alone. No guests, no reporters, just me. The reading room was quiet, lit only by the soft morning sun filtering through the windows. Dust floated in the air like stardust. I walked the aisles slowly, running my fingers across the spines of books. Stories I once had to borrow in secret. Stories I now own the shelves for. Near the back of the main hall, there was a marble pedestal with a bronze plaque. I hadn't approved it. Professor Maynard had it installed himself. It read, in honor of Addison Ruth Whitmore, who was once told she couldn't. So she did. I stared at it for a long time, not because I needed the world to see it, but because somewhere deep inside, the girl who once cried over rejection letters, the girl who once thought James Carlton was her future, the girl who used to sit on hay bales reading Jane Austen by candlelight, she needed to see it. She needed to know she'd made it. Not to the ballroom, not to the altar, not to the university's acceptance list, but past them, through them, and into something much greater. Outside, life moved on. The Carlton family had left Silverpine entirely. Their estate sold in silence. Charles Carlton retired in disgrace. James, I heard, had taken a teaching position in Boston but hadn't attended a single public event since. They disappeared like dust from a shaken rug. That's the thing about legacy built on entitlement, it crumbles faster than stone. But mine was built on being denied, being forgotten, being told no so many times that it stopped meaning anything. And now, every young girl who walks through those tall oak doors walks on land I once fought to touch. They don't know the full story, not yet, but they feel it. They feel it in the silence between the shelves, in the warmth of a librarian's smile, in the way their names are written on the first page of every grant file. They feel it in possibility, that word, the one they once tried to strip from me. I have it back now, and I gave it away freely, to those who needed it most. Sometimes I visit the tree, the old chestnut at the edge of Silverpine, where James once carved our initials. The bark has grown over it now. You can barely see the J+A, just a faint scar. That's all he ever was, a scar, one I no longer feel. But I don't regret it, not the love, not the betrayal, not even the tears, because without it, I wouldn't have burned down the silence, and from that silence, I wouldn't have built this place, this legacy, this revolution dressed as a library. People often ask me now, if you could go back, would you change anything? I always say no, because I know that for every girl denied, dismissed, and overlooked, there's a fire being lit, and if they're lucky, someone will try to stamp it out, because that's when the fire grows teeth. That's when the girl stops begging to be let in and starts buying the house. The end questions to reflect on. Why do you think Addison chose silence as her weapon rather than public confrontation? Do you believe James truly regretted his choices, or was his letter just guilt? Would the story have ended differently if Addison accepted the scholarship and stayed in love? What does it mean to own something not just legally, but emotionally and symbolically? Subscribe to more revenge stories. Share, like, comment.